just jump right into panel 1. Again, para los hispanohablantes, hay audífonos atrás si necesita ayuda con la traducción, okay? The first panel discussion, the topic is shaping the future of supply chain resilience. Now, the world is looking for better, more reliable supply chains that can better withstand future shocks, unpredictable challenges and changes. So we understand that there are winners and losers as supply chains are adapting and reformulating themselves. So the questions are, what have we learned? What changes are temporary? Which ones are the ones that will persist into the near future? Are we ready? What are we going to do about it? And how can we adjust and adapt? Well, the moderator for that panel discussion is Professor the Honorable Gordon Shirley, who was just here a while ago. He will be our moderator and he will introduce our esteemed panelists. So again, this is panel 1, Shaping the Future of Supply Chain Resilience. We welcome our panel, our panelists as well as our moderator. Please make them welcome.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator, for introducing the panel. Let me say, ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for being here in 2 sessions back to back, but I'm really delighted to be a part of a group as distinguished as this one. As the moderator has said, during the past 2.5 years, we have had unprecedented disruptions in the global supply chain brought on by the pandemic and exemplified by the congestion at all of the major ports from Los Angeles to Shanghai and everywhere in between, as well as the rapid escalation of the cost of transportation and dislocation and unreliable shipping schedules. The panel seeks to understand just how supply chains have evolved and what are the lessons learned from the disruption of the past 1.5 years. What are the major changes that have occurred and which of these are temporary, which ones are likely to be more permanent? The goal is to provide persons who participate in this discussion, including yourselves, with recommendations for building more robust and resilient supply chains in the face of complex and uncertain futures. Let me introduce very briefly the members of the panel, and then I'm going to ask them each to make an opening statement of about 5 to 7 minutes. And then we'll have an interchange between the panelists and then some time for question and answers from you. I'll introduce all 4 of them and then ask each one to come up, one following the other. We'll lead off the discussion with Dr. Paul Kent, who is a Senior Vice President and Managing Director of Monument Economic Group, where he leads the ports and logistic practice. Dr. Kent has been engaged in over 200 port, transport, and logistic projects in over 50 countries and has advised many multilateral organizations, regulators, and investors. He has also testified as an expert witness in international arbitration matters on issues of port concession and regulation. And I'm pleased to say that Dr. Kent was integrally involved in the Cayman Special Economic Zone feasibility study that was introduced by the Prime Minister earlier and in the presentation which was just completed. Dr. Kent holds a PhD in maritime economics from the Russian Central Scientific Institute for Water Transport Economics and Operations in Moscow, an MSc in Urban Studies from the University of New Orleans, and a Master in Public Administration from West Virginia University. Our next panelist, Shannon Fura, is an expert in import and export law, intellectual property, and international affairs with over 20 years of experience. Mrs. Fura is a founding partner in the international trade law firm of Page Fura PC. She has a doctorate in jurisprudence from the IIT Chicago Kent College of Law and an MA in international transactions from the George Mason University. She has been admitted to the bar in the state of Illinois as well as in the U.S. Court of International Trade. She's a member of numerous associations and is also a licensed customs broker. Our next panelist will be Cesar Zingone. He's an economist and an entrepreneur. Cesar is the CEO of Zeta Group, a real estate family business currently specializing in industrial parks and free zones, shopping centers, and residential communities. He's a board director of the World Free Zones Organization. Mr. Zingone holds an MBA with honors from the IMD Business School in Lausanne and the Advanced Management Development Certification in Real Estate Development from the Harvard Business School. And then our fourth panelist, Titania Ray Bellet, is the Director for Transit and the TIR system, International Road Transport System, in the International Road Transport Union, which is headquartered in Geneva. The mission of the International Road Transport Union is to bring together business entities, regulatory authorities, and those who serve and use the global transport and logistics sectors in over 80 countries across the globe. Mrs. Ray Billett leads the work of the International Road Transport Union in trade and transit facilitation, promoting best practices and international instruments related to transport. For over 70 years, her organization has managed the International Road Transport System, which is the only global system of international transits which ensures security and facilitation across multiple borders. In close partnership with the UN, the IRU advocates and implements solutions enhancing the resilience and imparting robustness to supply chains, topics which Titania has made several important presentations recently. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists in the order in which I have introduced them to come up to make their 5 to 7 minute presentation, and then we'll have a discussion between them. I'm informed that you each have mics, and therefore you don't have to come up to the lectern. You can stay right where you are and make your presentation. So Paul, I'll ask you to lead up.
Thank you very much, Doctor. It's good to see you again. It's good to be in Jamaica at any time. Doesn't have to wait a couple years. It's always nice to be here. Well, it's interesting the period of time that we're living right now because, first of all, we heard all of the languages that are represented here in the audience. And the most common language I am happy to hear is really ports and logistics. And it took me 40 years to finally see such big interest in the ports and logistics sector today. And it's frequently, I understand, a topic of conversation at the dinner table. So it's nice to see that even young children are beginning to understand the nature of the beast that we are being challenged by today. I will speak primarily from the point of view of the United States, although the majority of my work is internationally. But I think the United States represents a very good case study of what can go wrong if proper planning is not in place. What kicked off the process in the United States to the degree that we have the problems that we now have was the COVID relief payments that 85% of our population received. So they suddenly were cash rich and hungry to buy, and that created an increase in e-commerce. It went from 15% of retail sales to 32% of retail sales in 1 year. Now, the United States is not alone in that. We saw 23% increases, according to UNCTAD, in the UK, Korea, and China. So, again, we're not alone in this, but we are seeing similar problems. And I've done some research, and it seems that all the just-in-time JIT philosophy that has been preached to us over the years, and the concept of lean logistics has seemingly run its course, at least in terms of its ability to respond to supply chain disruptions. And I'll give you some examples here. We have in our business what is called capacity utilization. And what has happened over the years is that there has been a reduction in what we call slack capacity. And slack capacity, taught to us by JIT and Lean Logistics, really means that this is capacity that you're not using, and if you did, you can generate more revenue. Okay? And for guys like me, I'm a port economist, people in my background, and I think with many practitioners out there, that if you have slack capacity, that's what you need for good performance. You don't want too much capacity. But there are thresholds that have been developed over the years that are commonly accepted. In the area of container ports, we look at 65 to 75% capacity utilization. If you exceed that, you're raising the risk of congestion in the ports. In warehousing, we have a similar milestone, a threshold of 80 to 85% capacity utilization. So if the warehousing business is exceeding 85%, it is also creating a risk of congestion. And now remember that ports and warehouses, they feed cargo to each other. Yes, so if one is having a capacity problem and then you have another one having the capacity problem, you can't avoid the congestion problem. So we also have another issue going on, and that is with the shipping lines. And the shipping lines have created global alliances, container shipping lines. They have created global alliances so that there are fewer players that are in the big game of containers. Okay, you have the 2M Alliance, the Alliance, THE Alliance, and Ocean Alliance, of which CMA CGM is a part. And they operate the marine terminals through Terminal Link. But they carry 90% of global container trade. And the issue with the alliances is that they were actually created to manage capacity utilization through slot sharing arrangements across the members of their alliance. They would be able to minimize slack capacity and increase utilization of vessels. So we have that avenue as well. And when you increase the utilization of each vessel, you can reduce the inventory of your vessels overall. The other problems that we have are container evacuations. And here we had a lack of trucking and chassis capacity. Lack of trucking, there's been a lot of news on it, but it's also traced to the expanded cycle time of delivering a container to the port, having to wait in the queue, and likely not getting the container on the backhaul. We have a similar problem with chassis. And in the United States, we're unique because we manage chassis as a pool system that is not controlled by the trucking companies. And the chassis companies that provide chassis that move containers back and forth, they're under the control of the shipping lines through what is called legacy contracts. The shipping lines used to control the chassis. They sold that equipment to chassis-oriented companies, and they are beholden to the shipping lines because they have contracts to serve the shipping lines. So they are not always available to serve other shipping lines if their business is taken up by their main customer. So those are the problems. I wanted just to set out the playing field that we are in today, and perhaps later we can talk a little bit about solutions.
Thank you, Paul. Shannon?
Is it on? Hear me? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I just want to thank, obviously, the World Free Zone Organization as well as our host country. I'm embarrassed to say this is my first time to Jamaica, and I can see a return coming very soon. So thank you for your hospitality. As Paul mentioned, I'm going to talk about a little bit from the perspective of a practitioner. So as outside trade counsel to companies that are trying to operate in this environment, I'm going to talk a little bit about where we've gone and kind of where we are, and then, as he mentioned, talk about some of the ways in which hopefully companies can look to ameliorate the problems that we're in. So when we look at the supply chain and we look from a little bit from a US-centric perspective, the early part of the decade really saw a continued movement towards sourcing from China and Southeast Asia. And that really started as a change, started to change as the US started to really flex its trade policy. We certainly saw that through the administrations, most predominantly with the Trump administrations, where trade suddenly became really the hot topic. As we jokingly say in the US, anyone who operates in my field, we suddenly became the cool kids at the cocktail party. Everyone suddenly understood what trade meant. They understood the impacts and the detriments, right, of policy. But it really, you know, that impact really really focused on the margins, but it really took, as Paul mentioned, larger shocks to the system to really have companies step back and take a more deeper assessment and look at their supply chain as a whole. And those larger shocks, Paul mentioned some from his perspective, some additional ones, obviously you had, the pandemic obviously being first and foremost, but you had sourcing choke points, you had single sources of supply, you certainly have the ongoing issues between the US and China, which heavily impacted the situation. And you also have, obviously, most notably, the recent war between Russia and the Ukraine. So when you're looking at some of those things, you also have to also consider things like, from an operational perspective, labor shortages. You have to look at things like the West Coast renegotiation of contracts with the longshoremen. Those types of things that are going to impact the local ports, but then also from the larger perspective of, you know, where are we in the world right now with respect to the different trade policies that are set. And when you're looking, I believe it was the Prime Minister earlier who, one of the things he said is you need to think more locally, or at least, at the very least, regionally. And that really is something that we've certainly seen come to bear. When you look at the lessons that we've learned, the first and foremost is don't put all your eggs in one basket, right? And I think we can say that from several different perspectives. The disruptions from earthquakes to fires to the pandemic, to supply shortages certainly have wreaked havoc with all the carefully laid plans that companies put in place. Many of our clients go into their supply chains and their supply chain relationships, they go into them for the long term. They have years of study and years of working with other suppliers to make sure they have quality that they need, they have the materials that they need. So the contracts that they put in place are intended to be long term. What ends up happening, and what you've certainly seen come out of the more recent situations, is the fact that that puts companies in a position where they're not able to be nimble. They're not able to move their supply, and they certainly can't do it quickly. And with some of the things that we've now seen coming down the pike, it's proven that it is very difficult for them, that they do need to be able to move quickly. And we'll talk a little bit about ESG when we talk about environmental sustainability and corporate governance. And I think you'll certainly see one of the lessons learned, and one of the things that companies are doing to try to mitigate the challenge is to make both internally and externally their supply chains more nimble. Certainly the US government and other governments increased willingness to use trade policy not simply as a political tool, but also as an economic one, has also highlighted the naivete of believing the status quo can be maintained. Supply chains, as we've seen, definitely need to be dynamic, and I think what's really come to bear is that they're not. And which is, you know, this panel really is timely from that perspective. And I think a lot of people are focusing on the pandemic, that it really brought it to its head, but certainly there are other factors that have led up to it, and the pandemic merely was a little bit of the icing on the cake, and not in a good way. We also have seen that sustainability and ethical sourcing has taken front and center, and that's here to stay, and it will undoubtedly take on even greater significance in the years ahead. From the US perspective in particular, there is a law that was passed in December that is set to go into effect actually next week on Tuesday, and that's the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. Last night, in fact, companies have been waiting. They've been waiting for US Customs to issue guidance. How can we comply with this? How can we work with our supply chains? And this is just one example. It is set to go into effect on Tuesday. I mentioned the guidance came out last night. So companies, and if you all haven't seen it, I suggest you take a look at it. It's really an interesting, it's an interesting document. I think it's going to set the tone certainly for the future. We certainly saw some of this with conflict minerals several years ago, but with the forced labor consideration and with ethical sourcing, I think you're going to see it taken to a whole new level, and this is just the starting point. And it's going to be painful for companies. Companies really need to be able to, one, figure out how they can supply, two, look at their supply chains and figure out, do we have alternatives? Do we need alternatives? And I think you're going to see a lot of that start to change. For the U.S., you've also seen that an increased shift from China to Southeast Asian countries and Mexico as the principal source of supply. That is something that's a trend that is extremely likely to persist, and you're certainly going to see that given the state of the relations I mentioned with the U.S. and China, and that is not easing up anytime soon. So I think you're going to see many of our clients who may have moved their operations over to China and are now looking at other opportunities. We keep hearing a lot about nearshoring, reshoring, friendly shoring, and those are not just passing trends. Those are trends that are really taking root, and as companies really try to look to what other options they may have, and we're certainly going to continue to see investment in either new or expanded sources of supply. As I mentioned, the growing focus on forced labor will also impact sourcing patterns, certainly, and require a significant investment with companies in their infrastructures. And again, we talked about that supplier relationship. Looking at your supplier relationships, companies are going to have to look internally and decide and bring other players in to make those decisions now. The purchasing departments, for example, aren't going to be the only ones brought into the equation. And understanding what other options companies have may be closer to home, wherever the home may be. For future purposes, the movement really to dual sourcing and the near reshoring concept and ordering earlier, increasing inventory buffers, that's definitely going to continue for the next several years. Paul mentioned about the just-in-time inventory, and we've certainly seen that become quickly a thing of the past. But the challenge becomes for companies that have been focused on just-in-time inventory, what happens to those sectors where just-in-time still is important, like perishable items or agriculture? And so companies are really trying to look at the routes and the supply chains that they have to be able to address that. So that's something that you're certainly going to see. Costing pressures obviously will challenge that approach in the longer term, but I would tell you that I think we anticipate that you may have some bad or old habits that are certainly going to rear their heads again as things may ease, as the pandemic may ease, as trade relations may hopefully normalize. Hopefully we won't see companies go back to these models, but I think certainly if a company is really looking at how to be sustainable going forward in the future, they realize that they need to have redundancy. They need to realize that they have alternatives. And they also need to be able to look at their supply chains and anticipate not just the supply chain, the logistics risk, but also the political risk and the economic risk and their operational risk. And I think you're going to see not just for certainly the U.S. government focus on this very heavily, but I think you're certainly seeing other governments focus on it as well. And making sure that you do have strong supplier relations, I think is going to be crucial. And as I mentioned, redundancy. It's not just redundancy in your supply chain externally, as again, it's also redundancy internally. So making sure that if something goes down or a part of your operation is impacted, another part of your operation can step in and address it. And I see, my colleagues are going to talk a little bit from the logistics perspective, from routes and we talked a little bit about containers, and we'll talk about the trucking. But certainly I think that's the biggest takeaway, is that companies are really looking not just externally, but they're looking internally as well as to how to become more sustainable.
Good morning. So, ladies and gentlemen, when I was at business school, supply chains, the class of supply chains, was the most boring topic around, and there were people yawning. Now, on top of that, we're standing here between you guys and lunchtime, and also 2 minutes ago, a soccer match started between Costa Rica and New Zealand, and Costa Rica is playing for the final place in the World Cup. So all these reasons make it worthwhile to be speedy. However, supply chains have become a very hot topic nowadays. It's not boring anymore. It's intersecting with macroeconomics, with geopolitics, and so on. So it's become a very interesting and topic, and everybody's talking about it. And there are many buzzwords, and we repeat the same concepts among all of us. And we think that what we're saying is what's going to happen. But in fact, I think we all have many questions, and we don't know what the answers are going to be, because geopolitics is really what's going to define how supply chains are going to take their shape in the future. So we've been living in the past 40 to 50 years in a neoliberal world where globalization was pushed, transportation was made as cheap as possible, specialization of labor and production was optimized, and all this was based on a economic model, a theory, elaborated by two Swedish economists, Heckscher and Olin, in the 1930s, and they themselves based it on David Ricardo's theory. And so the world has moved in the past 40 years in this direction, culminating in the year 2000 when China entered the WTO, and the US was very optimistic with that, thinking that China would be brought into a world order of trade. But then in 2010, the United States started complaining about the Chinese yuan being undervalued. Then that brought us to the Trump administration, who began the trade war with China. After that, the pandemic kicked in with the lockdowns, and that created a supply shock, supply shortage and breakdown of the supply chain worldwide. Well, then came the rebound after the pandemic, with central banks lending out money in an uncontrolled fashion. And so that created a demand shock. Okay, then on top of that, we have the war in Ukraine, with all its consequences that we all know on food prices, fuel prices. So now we have the perfect storm right now. So what's going to happen? Well, my point of view is that the world will become a dual economy, two worlds. One focused on the US dollar, which is all of the American continent and Europe, and the other part of the world, which is the Far East, Middle East, India, and so on, based on the Chinese yuan. And also Russia has been pushed by being excluded from the SWIFT system to adhere to the Chinese systems. Okay, so the world will be divided roughly in two big blocks. So what does this mean for us? If I were to give a tagline to this presentation, it would be, get out of China. Major companies, especially European and American companies, if they need to open a new factory or move an existing factory, they're not going to look at China anymore. They're going to look at this part of the world. So this really matters for us. And this is the famous nearshoring that everybody's talking about, but these are the reasons behind it. So what's the time frame for this? I think this is a major change that happens once in a lifetime. And it may take anywhere between 5 to 10 years. So we have this window of opportunity to try to bring the big companies from the Far East to this part of the world and to serve the North American and European markets. how are we going to do this? Well, in the free zone system, there are basically three players. One is the government that sets the rules and the infrastructure and all the conditions. The second player are the developers and operators, which are the ones that make free zones come to a reality. And the third players are the companies or the tenants that produce and export and employ and are the economic engine. So if we understand well how the manufacturing system is built, it's a pyramid, it's a tiering system with the highest tier. Tier number one is the one that has contact with the final consumer, and then it goes down to suppliers, suppliers of suppliers, and down into a pyramid of tiers. So which companies do we aspire to bring to this side of the world? Well, we have to focus on tiers 1, 2, and 3. The highest tiers are the ones that are easier to move to this part of the world. And I was speaking with Chinese colleagues and analysts, and they say that it's wishful thinking to believe that China is going to be cut off completely from the rest of the world. That's not going to happen, because the lowest tiers of production will remain in China. I will give you two figures. China is producing 60% of the world's steel, and it's producing roughly 30% of the world's machines or tools. So if we want to move a factory, we still depend on China providing the machines and tools. So this dual world will always need to keep a good link with China. Okay, so that's important for countries and governments to understand. In our case, we're based in Costa Rica. We're real estate free zone developers. Costa Rica has a privileged relationship with China, and that makes it easy and attractive for companies to locate themselves in Costa Rica, import raw materials from China, and then re-export to North America. And if we compare that with Mexico, for instance, Mexico has a great advantage because it's very close to the United States, but they don't have such a good relationship with China. It's more complicated and more expensive to import goods from China. So I would conclude saying that there's a great opportunity that we all have right now, and in this side of the world, Central America, South America, and Caribbean, we have to take this opportunity. What the companies are looking for are big areas, okay? Not anymore small warehouses. Here we're talking about warehouses of 5,000, 10,000 or more square meters. So that's what we need. And we need the right conditions from the government, and we need to find cheap land, good land, and abundant labor. And we need to make this happen, because otherwise we'll lose this 5 to 10 year window of great opportunity. Thank you.
He's giving the score.
Okay, it's lunchtime, we can go.
Good afternoon. If I were asked to say how the supply chains have been evolving, just two words, I would say that it's growing complexity, ever-growing complexity. And as Shannon has just said, it's very difficult to change contracts between private parties. This will take time, which means that they still need to send goods from one point to another point. But the question is how to send these goods. What should be the routes? Because some routes are not possible anymore. There are bottlenecks, and that's why the industry needs to be very creative and then to consider plans B, C, in order to move goods from one point to another. Because after all, trade is like electricity. If one route, if one way is blocked, then trade is going to find other ways to move goods from the point of departure to the point of destination. So this growing complexity had two consequences, among others. So one, since there are more actors who need to interact, and there are more switches from one mode to another, there are also more loopholes for illicit trade, and there are more risks for security. This is one. The second, there are more hurdles, because the routes are changing, there are more borders to be crossed, again, there are more actors to interact, and there are more obstacles, and more procedures, more documentation. So again, this will increase the cost, this increases the time of the transportation. And then how to combat these two consequences? Among other answers, 3 ways to do that can be digitalization, and we can see that digitalization in transport has been evolving super fast, and it was boosted by the pandemic. The second is we need to instill the mechanisms bringing trust to trade, and not only among private partners, but also between public sector and private sector and public sector. And thirdly, we need to consider and actively use the mechanisms supporting harmonization, so that all third-party actors interact with each other using the same rules of the game. Because if people play the same rules of the game, there will be less documentation, there will be fewer procedures, and this will bring down the costs and also the time of transportation. I would like to share with you one such harmonization mechanism which my organization manages all over the world, and it is called the tier system. So tier system, first of all, tier is a French abbreviation. It stands for Transport International Routier. J'ai un petit peu de français. And in English, this means International Road Transport. It is the system which was created by my organization, International Road Transport Union, back in 1949, just after the Second World War. And why it was created after the Second World War? Because Europe needed to restore its economy. And for that, countries needed to trade. And in order to trade, they needed to facilitate border crossing. And this is how the tier system was created, in order to facilitate the border crossing by bringing security and, based on security, facilitation. Now then the system was so successful that it was turned into a UN convention in 1959, and now it exists as a UN tier convention, and IRU is mandated by tier contracting parties and the UN to manage this convention all over the world, and today there are 77 countries which are contracting parties. So what is this? A tier is the only global transit system which provides only one document, which is, by the way, now becoming digital, only one document, which is the customs declaration and the guarantee for customs, which is accepted in all countries along the route from departure to destination. So you can imagine to which extent it reduces documentation and procedures along the way. You don't need to be confused by the name of the convention. That's International Road Transport, which is in the name of the convention. The system can cover all modes of transport, doesn't matter which mode of transport is used, provided at least one leg of the transport is carried out by road. And we know that globally an estimate of 90% of goods are transported by sea, but guess what? Around almost 100% of goods at any point of time were carried out in a truck. So this means that the system can be practically applied to any transport, of course, if it passes the countries which use the tier convention, the tier system. It's not surprising that in the recent years, with this growing complexity, we could see a wave of new countries acceding to the tier system, notably in the Gulf. It was the UAE, which was the first, and it was followed by Saudi Arabia, Oman, Qatar, and now this wave goes outside the GCC region, and our newest accession to the convention was Egypt. And we can see that the interest is growing, and just at the end of this month, I will go to Casablanca for a big workshop for African countries, which also realize that they need to reduce non-tariff barriers, and in particular, look into the ways how to harmonize border crossing procedures in order to facilitate the trade based on security mechanisms. And this is what tier system brings. Very solid security, because tier has very solid security mechanisms related to vehicles, related to transport companies, and of course related to the guarantee to customs authorities. And based on that strong security, the system provides facilitation for trade. So the main takeaway is that the growing complexity requires response measures, and one of such response measures is harmonization. In order to be more resilient, the countries need to consider using in full such harmonization instruments which facilitate border crossing, facilitate trade and transit.
Thank you very much, panelists. I've been told that although we have a bit more time on our clock, that because Cesar pointed out that the Costa Rica match is a very important match, and because he also pointed out that lunch is important, that we have to truncate it. However, I'd like to allow for one round of questions if there are any burning questions from the floor. Yes, sir, at the back.
Thank you to all the speakers. And I only have two questions. One would be for the moderator, for Mr. Gordon Shirley. What is the rationality on the Jamaican government policy when you talk that you have the steamship lines that are being or that have been given concessions in the case of the Port of Kingston I suppose, to invest in the port so that the government would not have to put their own money in those terminals. And then you have the free trade zones that you talked about before, and you have this business model where the government is putting, or if you could tell us a little bit more, the government is putting money on the development of these trade zones, or is that also being given to the private sector to develop it? And to Mr. Cesar, he talked about the nearshoring and the Chinese companies coming to the Americas, and to have them export maybe manufacturers to North America. And he said also about exporting to Europe. So if we maybe when we heard Tatiana regarding her visit to North Africa, and she says we have all these countries also, maybe some of them are trying to get employment for an opportunity for their own people, and maybe they are also looking at these opportunities that China is opening because of the logistics. How would the Latin America and the Caribbean countries would provide opportunities to have these manufacturers to export to Europe, comparing them to other places in the north of Africa, or maybe the Middle East, or maybe other countries in Asia? Thank you.
Thank you. Cesar, do you wish to go first?
So, can you repeat the question exactly? The opportunity to link with Europe, is that it?
I think that's it, yes. You could go ahead and answer that.
Okay, well, our major market in this part of the world is North America. Europe is less. So we need to aim to North America and especially to the Gulf area and East, because the ports on the Gulf and the East Coast are, they work better than on the West Coast. The West Coast has been the bottleneck for trade from Asia, and so we are in a position here in this part of the world to export to the United States in the easiest and cheapest operating ports. Whereas for Europe, there's a very nice map that I can't show you now, but it shows the trade routes of the world. And the busiest trade routes are between Europe and the Americas already. So, you know, of course there is opportunity to increase exports to Europe. That depends on companies that already have their market in Europe relocating to this part of the world. But we compete also with Eastern Europe and North Africa, okay, that are closer to Europe. So our natural vocation here is North America.
Thank you very much, Cesar. I'll be very brief in my response. I think I understood your question to be the process of the concession agreement for the terminal, and why does the government invest in free zones and not leave it just to the private sector. In respect of the concession agreement, the government was not in a position to finance any further development of our terminals. It was at a time when Panama had just decided to expand the canal to take 14,000 TEU vessels. There was a very complex process, or a very involved process of getting global terminal operators to compete. Arising out of that process, a transparent bidding process and evaluation process, CMA, CGM's Terminal Link was the successful bidder. They were required to make certain investments within a 5-year period, and they have exceeded the expectation in terms of completing those investments ahead of time. In respect of the free zones, why does the government become involved? Because the private sector, the way that the private sector addresses risk and the way it deals with risk, sometimes the government has to de-risk certain environments, and once the private sector understands it and the risk becomes manageable for them, then they will take it and move on from that. So for example, in our free zones that we have, of the 5 of them, 4 of them principally focus on business process outsourcing. This is an area that were initiated in the free zones operated by the Port Authority, incubated there and has grown up, and now the private sector has begun to invest quite considerably in that area. And this is why the government has said we needed to move away from a focus on that area to begin to focus on logistics, which we have been talking about for a very long time. And you heard his mandate today. He was unequivocal. It has to happen now. And so, and you heard our chairman also in his answer to the question that was asked of him, indicating that our preference is to do this in partnership with the private sector. And that will be our objective going forward, that while we might initiate things, our goal is to embrace private participation, both from local private participation as well as international private participation. I've been told again that we are out of time, but my colleagues, I don't think we'll have time to discuss it, but Paul and Shannon, the issue of spare capacity. When you were in business school, spare capacity tends to come with inefficiencies. You need to have excess capacity to deal with inefficiencies in your system, not just to deal with uncertainty. And once you start putting back spare capacity, you have to guard against inefficiencies creeping back in. And there will be an interesting discussion around that. Secondly, Cesar, when in your model of the world, which decomposes into 2 zones, there are all sorts of complexities associated with that. I'll just use one simple one. People tend not to go just to locations that have the cheapest labor, but where they have better problem-solving skills, better skills that allow them to innovate and develop over time. And so it's not going to be just about labor where companies locate, but the quality of the ecosystems that are in there. And those 2 zones are going to have to compete against each other. So we are initiating a round of discussion that I think will go well beyond this panel. Ladies and gentlemen, I would ask you to join me in thanking our panelists for, I think, an excellent set of comments. Thank you very much to you.
All right, thank you so very much, Professor, for ably moderating. Thank you very much to the panelists. Okay, I think they just want to get a photo op. Certainly speaking about the ever-growing complexity, the opportunities that exist, it's not just about a cheaper labor force, oopsie, but it's also about having the quality of the ecosystems, the training and the upskilling of the ecosystems of your country.